I stood in the doorway of our bedroom watching Rebecca zip her weekend bag with the kind of precision she used for everything. Her movements were sharp, practiced, final. She didn't look at me when she said spouses weren't invited to the retreat. Her voice had that edge it got when she'd already decided the conversation was over. I asked if she was sure because I could have sworn the email mentioned +1s. She snapped the suitcase shut and told me not to embarrass her by showing up uninvited. The Uber arrived 3 minutes later. She kissed my cheek without meeting my eyes and rolled her suitcase across our hardwood floor. The door closed. The house went quiet. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at nothing, trying to figure out when my wife started treating me like a problem she needed to solve. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was warm and confused. He introduced himself as Kenneth Bradshaw, CEO of Cascade Technologies. He apologized for calling my personal number but said Rebecca had listed me as her emergency contact. I felt my stomach tighten. He asked if everything was alright because he'd been expecting to meet me at the retreat tonight. I told him I wasn't aware spouses were invited. There was a pause, the kind that stretches too long and means something. He laughed awkwardly and said every executive was encouraged to bring family. In fact, most already had. He mentioned the dinner starting in an hour and said he'd hoped to finally put a face to the name. I heard voices in the background, champagne glasses clinking, someone calling his name. He apologized again and said he must have misunderstood. Before hanging up, he added that he hoped I felt better soon. I hadn't said I was sick. Rebecca had. I sat on the couch staring at my phone for 10 minutes before opening my laptop. Cascade Technologies had an active social media presence. Rebecca always complained about it, said the marketing team posted too much. I found their page easily. The company retreat was already being documented in real time. Photos from the welcome reception filled the screen. Executives in business casual. Smiling couples holding wine glasses. A banner that read, Leadership Summit 2024, Bring Your Crew. I scrolled slowly, my chest tightening with each image. Then I saw her. Rebecca stood near a tall window, laughing at something. She wasn't alone. A man stood close, too close, his hand resting on the small of her back. His face was angled toward hers like they were sharing a private joke. The caption underneath read, Our visionary leaders connecting before the big weekend. I recognized him immediately. His name was Jared Langston, Senior Vice President of Strategy. Rebecca had mentioned him exactly twice. The first time was 8 months ago when she said he'd be mentoring her through a promotion track. She called him brilliant, driven, someone who saw her potential. The second time was 3 months later when I asked why she was working late again. She'd sighed and said Jared needed her input on a presentation. Just business. When I'd suggested we invite him and his wife for dinner sometime, she'd looked at me like I'd suggested setting the house on fire. She said he was very private and wouldn't appreciate that. Now I stared at the photo. His hand. Her smile. The way her body leaned toward his like gravity worked differently around him. I scrolled to the comments. Someone had written, Power Duo. Cascade's future right there. I called my mother-in-law. I don't know why. Maybe I thought she'd have answers. Maybe I just needed to hear someone tell me I was overreacting. Pamela answered on the third ring, her voice tight with annoyance. She asked what I wanted. I told her about the CEO's call, about the photos, about Rebecca lying. She went quiet. Then she said something I'd heard before but never understood. She told me some rooms weren't meant for people like me. That Rebecca was building something important and I needed to stop clinging to her like dead weight. She said successful women made sacrifices and so did the people who loved them. I asked if lying was one of those sacrifices. She hung up. I sat there holding my phone, replaying every interaction I'd had with Pamela over the past year. The tight smiles. The comments about Rebecca outgrowing things. The way she looked at me like I was furniture. She'd known. Maybe not everything, but enough. I went back through Rebecca's emails. She usually left her laptop open, password saved, never worried about privacy because she said we had nothing to hide. I felt sick doing it but I couldn't stop. I searched for retreat and found the original invitation from 4 months ago. The subject line read, Cascade Leadership Retreat, Family Welcome. The email was detailed. 3 days at a resort 2 hours north. Team building, strategic planning, and partner activities. There was even a section about childcare services for executives with kids. At the bottom, a registration link asked how many guests each person was bringing. Rebecca had written 1. Then 3 weeks later, she'd forwarded the email to herself with a note, confirm solo attendance. She'd changed her answer. She'd erased me deliberately. I took a screenshot. Then another. Then I started a folder on my desktop and named it Timeline. I didn't know what I was building yet, but I knew I'd need proof. I didn't call her. I didn't text asking why she lied. Every instinct screamed to confront her, to demand answers, to make her explain. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look on her face when she left, that cold certainty that I'd just accept whatever she told me. Maybe it was Pamela's voice calling me dead weight. Or maybe it was the CEO's confused kindness, the way he'd assumed I was sick because that's what Rebecca told him. I realized something sitting in our too-quiet house. The moment I asked questions, she'd have answers ready. She'd been preparing for this conversation long before I knew it needed to happen. So I didn't give her the chance. I opened a new document and started writing everything down. Dates, emails, photos, conversations I'd dismissed as nothing. The pattern was there. I just hadn't been looking. If she thought silence meant ignorance, I'd let her keep thinking that. Kenneth Bradshaw called again Saturday morning. This time he apologized more carefully, like he'd spent the night wondering if he'd said something wrong. He told me he'd spoken with Rebecca and she'd confirmed I was feeling under the weather. He hoped I'd recover soon. Then his voice changed. He asked if everything was okay at home. Not about the retreat. About home. I told him everything was fine, kept my voice steady and unremarkable. He didn't sound convinced. He said Rebecca was a valuable part of his team and he wanted to make sure she had the support she needed, professionally and personally. The way he said it made my skin crawl. He wasn't checking on me. He was checking on her. Before we hung up, he mentioned that leadership positions required trust and transparency. That Cascade's culture was built on integrity. I told him I understood. After the call ended, I stared at his number. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. I started asking questions. Carefully. I called an old colleague of Rebecca's, someone she used to get drinks with before she got too busy for friendships. Her name was Simone and she still worked at Cascade in a different department. I asked casually how the retreat was going, said I'd seen photos online. She hesitated before answering. Then she told me something that made my hands go cold. Rebecca had been telling people at work she was single. Not divorced. Not separated. Just unattached. Simone had seen her at a happy hour 2 months ago and asked about me. Rebecca had smiled and said we'd grown apart and were figuring things out. Simone thought we were separated. She'd had no idea Rebecca was still wearing her wedding ring at home and sleeping in our bed every night. I asked if anyone else knew. Simone said most people assumed Rebecca was focused on her career, that she'd sacrificed personal relationships for professional success. They admired her for it. I found the message by accident. Rebecca's iPad synced to her phone and I'd borrowed it to check a recipe. A notification popped up. A text thread with her mother. I shouldn't have opened it. I did anyway. The messages went back months. Pamela advising Rebecca to keep her home life separate from her professional image. Telling her that bringing a spouse to company events would make her seem less committed, less available, less hungry. One message from 6 weeks ago made me sit down. Pamela had written, "You're building an empire. Don't let anyone think you're distracted by domestic obligations. These men need to see you as their equal, not someone's wife." Rebecca had responded with a thumbs up emoji. Another message from last month. "The retreat is your moment. Go alone. Make them see you." I took photos of everything. The advice. The strategy. The deliberate erasure of our marriage for the sake of her career. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. Sunday night, a photo leaked. Not on the company page. Someone had posted it to a private group that I shouldn't have had access to, but Simone sent it to me after I asked her to keep her eyes open. The photo showed a small dinner. 8 people at a table. Rebecca sat between Kenneth and Jared. Her hand rested on Jared's forearm. Her head was tilted back, laughing. Kenneth looked uncomfortable. The others looked away from their plates like they were witnessing something they shouldn't. The photo was tagged as Saturday Leadership Dinner. Someone had commented, "Guess we know who's getting promoted." Another comment, quickly deleted but Simone had screenshotted it. "Is this professional or personal?" I studied Rebecca's face in the photo. She looked happy, relaxed, like herself. Like the version of herself that existed before she started looking at me like I was holding her back. I saved the image, added it to my folder. The timeline was getting clearer. I realized something sitting at my desk Tuesday morning while Rebecca was still at the retreat. I wasn't just a husband who'd been lied to. I was a witness. I had emails showing she'd misrepresented her personal status to executives. Photos proving inappropriate relationships that could look like favoritism or worse. Text messages from her mother coaching her to deceive her employer about her availability and commitment. If this was about optics and image, then I held every piece of evidence that could destroy the image she'd built. The question wasn't whether I had power. It was what I'd do with it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth. But I also understood that sometimes truth and revenge look identical from the outside. Someone else figured this out before I did. My phone rang Wednesday morning. Private number. A woman's voice, professional and careful. She said her name was Victoria and she worked in Cascade's HR department. She asked if we could talk. The text came Thursday morning while I was making coffee. Rebecca's flight was delayed but she'd be home by dinner. Then a second message, "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." Not, "I'm sorry I lied." Not, "We need to talk." Just damage control. She knew I knew. Someone must have told her about the CEO's calls, or maybe she'd seen her mother's messages and realized I had access. I stared at the text for 5 minutes. My fingers hovered over the keyboard a dozen times. I could have asked which part she meant. The lying about the retreat. The erasing me from her work life. The hand on Jared's back. The entire strategy she and her mother had built to make me invisible. Instead, I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. Silence was becoming my most powerful tool. Let her wonder what I knew. Let her rehearse explanations for accusations I hadn't made. Let her walk into our house unsure of what was waiting. I was done making things easy. Victoria from HR called again. She was careful, diplomatic, clearly trained in how to have uncomfortable conversations. She told me Kenneth had expressed concerns about misrepresentation within his leadership team. About executives crafting false narratives to advance their careers. She said they took workplace integrity seriously and were conducting quiet inquiries. She asked if I'd be willing to share my perspective. Not officially. Just a conversation. I asked what this was really about. She paused, then admitted that multiple people had raised questions about Rebecca's relationship status and whether she'd misrepresented her personal situation to gain professional advantages. Someone had also flagged potential conflicts of interest regarding her mentorship with Jared Langston. I told her I'd need to think about it. She said she understood but asked me to consider how my silence might protect people who'd been dishonest. Before hanging up, she gave me her direct line. I saved the number. Then I called Simone and asked exactly what Rebecca had told people about us. Pamela called Friday afternoon. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't pretend this was a friendly check-in. Her voice was ice. She told me that whatever I thought I knew, whatever I'd heard or seen, I needed to keep quiet. That Rebecca had worked too hard to let a jealous spouse ruin her opportunities. She said I'd always been threatened by Rebecca's success and now I was sabotaging her out of spite. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. When she finally paused, I asked one question. Did she know Rebecca told her so I was too sick to attend the retreat? Silence. I asked if she knew Rebecca had been presenting herself as single to colleagues for months. More silence. Then Pamela's voice changed. She told me to be very careful about what accusations I made. That Rebecca had witnesses and credibility and I had nothing but hurt feelings. I told her I was recording the call. I wasn't, but I wanted to see what she'd say. She hung up. I added notes to my timeline. Pamela wasn't just supporting Rebecca. She was directing her. Rebecca came home Sunday evening. 3 days after she left. Her suitcase wheels scraped across our floor the same way they had when she left. But everything else was different. She looked tired but triumphant. She dropped her bag and came to hug me. I let her. She smelled like hotel shampoo and something else, some cologne that wasn't mine. She pulled back and asked how I'd been. I said fine. She said the retreat had been exhausting but productive. Lots of networking, late strategy sessions, barely any sleep. She talked about breakout sessions and trust exercises and a keynote speaker who'd inspired everyone. She didn't mention Jared. She didn't mention the photos. She didn't mention lying to her CEO about why I wasn't there. She acted like nothing had happened because she assumed I didn't know anything had. I waited until she finished unpacking. Then I asked casually, like I was asking about the weather, why her CEO had called asking where I was. Her face changed. Just for a second. Then she recovered and smiled. She told me Kenneth must have been confused. That maybe someone else mentioned bringing a spouse and he'd mixed things up. I nodded like that made sense. I asked why he'd thought I was sick. She laughed, said she must have mentioned I wasn't feeling well and he'd misunderstood. Everything was a misunderstanding. Everything had a reasonable explanation. I didn't argue. I just asked one more question. Why did he call back asking if everything was okay at home? She stopped folding laundry. She said he was probably just being nice, that CEOs did that kind of thing. I told her he'd sounded concerned, like he thought something was wrong. Like he'd noticed something. Her jaw tightened. She asked what exactly I'd said to him. I told her the truth. That I'd said everything was fine. She relaxed slightly. Then I told her I'd scheduled a meeting with Victoria from HR to discuss workplace culture and transparency. I watched her face go pale. She asked why I'd do that. I said I thought it was important. She didn't ask what I planned to say. She already knew. I met Victoria the next morning at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Cascade's headquarters. She brought a colleague from legal. I brought my laptop and a folder thick with printed screenshots. I didn't start with accusations. I started with facts. I showed them the original retreat invitation with the family welcome language. Then Rebecca's edited registration changing from +1 to solo attendance. I showed them text messages from Pamela coaching Rebecca to present herself as unencumbered. I showed them the photo from the private dinner. I explained that I wasn't seeking legal action or revenge. I was providing context because Victoria had asked for my perspective. She took notes carefully. The legal colleague asked clarifying questions about dates and conversations. When I finished, Victoria closed her notebook and thanked me. She said this confirmed concerns they'd been tracking independently. That other employees had noticed inconsistencies in Rebecca's personal narrative. That the relationship with Jared had raised flags. She said they'd handle this internally and with discretion. I asked what that meant. She said the truth had consequences. Even when it was quiet. The changes started small. Jared was reassigned to a different project, reporting to a different executive. The official explanation was restructuring. Rebecca's calendar suddenly cleared. Meetings postponed. Strategy sessions moved. She came home Tuesday night looking shaken and asked if I'd heard anything about changes at Cascade. I said no. She told me people were acting strange, that projects were being reassigned, that Kenneth had canceled their weekly check-in. She said it felt like something was shifting and she didn't know why. I suggested maybe it was normal corporate adjustments. She looked at me like she was trying to decide if I was being genuine or cruel. Thursday morning, Simone texted me. She said rumors were spreading about an HR investigation into leadership conduct. That people were being called in for confidential interviews. That Rebecca's name kept coming up. Friday afternoon, Rebecca came home early. She'd been crying. She said she didn't understand what was happening but she knew I'd done something. I didn't deny it. The email chain surfaced Monday. Someone in IT had been asked to pull communication records as part of the investigation. They found months of messages between Pamela and 3 Cascade executives, including Kenneth. Pamela had been lobbying on Rebecca's behalf, praising her daughter's commitment, mentioning her availability, highlighting her lack of family distractions. In one email to Kenneth from 5 months ago, Pamela wrote that Rebecca had simplified her personal life to focus fully on professional growth. Kenneth had responded diplomatically but hadn't asked for clarification. Victoria called to tell me they'd found the messages. She said what started as questions about misrepresentation had evolved into concerns about nepotistic influence and manipulation of personnel decisions. Pamela wasn't an employee, but she'd positioned herself as an informal advisor. She'd shaped narratives about Rebecca that executives had relied on when making promotion decisions. This wasn't just about lying anymore. It was about systemic misconduct. Victoria asked if I'd known about Pamela's involvement. I sent her the screenshots I'd taken of Pamela's texts to Rebecca. She went quiet. Then she thanked me. Kenneth held a company-wide meeting Wednesday morning. Rebecca watched from her desk, pale and silent. Kenneth talked about transparency, about the importance of honest representation in leadership, about how Cascade's culture was built on trust and integrity. He mentioned the retreat specifically. He said they discovered that some team members had misrepresented their personal circumstances to colleagues and executives, creating false impressions about their availability and commitment. He didn't name anyone. He didn't have to. The entire company knew about Rebecca's solo attendance, about the photos with Jared, about the questions people had been asking quietly for months. When Kenneth finished, he said Cascade would be conducting a review of recent promotion decisions and mentorship assignments to ensure they were based on merit, not manufactured narratives. Rebecca sat frozen at her desk. People weren't looking at her directly, but she could feel their eyes. Simone texted me, "Everyone knows." I didn't respond. I was done being Rebecca's secret. They removed her from the leadership track Friday. Not fired. Not demoted officially. Just quietly reassigned to a project with no visibility and no advancement potential. Jared was let go entirely. The official reason was performance concerns, but everyone knew it was about the appearance of favoritism. Kenneth called Rebecca into his office and, according to what she told me later through tears, explained that her misrepresentation of her personal status had created liability for the company, that executives had made decisions based on false information, that her mother's involvement had made everything worse. He said they valued her work but couldn't ignore the breach of trust. She came home that night and finally broke. She sat on our couch and cried the kind of sobs that come from losing something you'd built your entire identity around. She said she'd only done what she thought was necessary to succeed, that everyone else played games and she just played them better. Until she didn't. I sat across from her and waited. I didn't comfort her. I didn't apologize. I just waited for her to say what she needed to say. She told me everything. How Pamela had convinced her that being married made her look less committed than male executives who had wives at home supporting them. How she'd started removing her ring at work events 2 years ago. How small lies became normal. How Jared had encouraged it, said they made a good team, that people saw them as equals. She said she'd never meant to hurt me, but she'd stopped thinking about me at all. I'd become invisible. A detail in her life she managed like everything else. She said the plan was to get promoted to VP, then tell everyone the truth. That she just needed to get through this phase. That it was temporary. I asked if she'd been sleeping with Jared. She said no. I asked if she'd wanted to. She didn't answer. I told her it didn't matter anymore. The marriage we had was built on a version of her that didn't exist. She'd erased me so completely that I'd started to erase myself. I told her I agreed about sacrifice. That successful people made sacrifices. She looked hopeful for a second. Then I told her what I was sacrificing. I moved out 3 weeks later. Not dramatically. No shouting or thrown plates. Just boxes and a lease on a small apartment across town. Rebecca asked if we could try counseling. I said no. She asked if I'd ever forgive her. I said forgiveness required wanting the person back, and I didn't want back someone who'd worked so hard to make me disappear. Pamela called once to scream at me for ruining her daughter's life. I hung up. Simone invited me to coffee and apologized for not seeing what was happening sooner. I told her it wasn't her job to see. Victoria sent a formal letter thanking me for my cooperation and noting that Cascade had implemented new policies around personal status transparency and family involvement in personnel matters. Rebecca's situation had changed their entire approach. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired, but I also felt visible again. Like I'd stopped being a ghost in my own life. Some nights I wondered if I could have handled it differently. Most nights I knew I'd handled it the only way that let me keep my dignity. I'd let the truth do the work revenge never could. I ran into Kenneth 6 months later at a downtown restaurant. He was with his wife. He recognized me immediately and came over. He apologized for everything, said he wished he'd asked harder questions sooner. He told me Rebecca had left Cascade 3 months after I moved out. That she'd found work at a smaller firm where nobody knew her story. He said he'd learned an important lesson from what happened. That sometimes the people you don't see are the ones telling you everything you need to know. His wife smiled kindly at me. Kenneth asked if I was doing okay. I told him I was. Better than okay, actually. As I left the restaurant, I saw Rebecca across the street. She was with someone new, a man in an expensive suit. She saw me too. For a second we just looked at each other. Then she turned away. I kept walking. People still ask me sometimes why I wasn't at that retreat. Now everyone who matters knows exactly who kept me away and what it cost them to try.